Hi, and welcome to the Stephan Livera podcast, focused on Bitcoin and Austrian economics. Today, I've got a very special guest, Connor Fromknecht from Lightning Labs, and we're going to be talking about watchtowers. But first, let me introduce my sponsors. First, Kraken. Over my years in Bitcoin, I've been impressed with the way Kraken operate in terms of offering strong security and really having that strong focus on security. They're acting ethically in the space under Jesse Powell's leadership. They are one of the longest standing Bitcoin exchanges, and they're consistently rated the best with a high quality platform offering the best liquidity in the industry. They've got high trading volume and low fees with no minimum or hidden fees. Kraken have 24/7 support, and I found it extremely fast to go through the sign up process as an individual. On the institutional and business solutions side, they're also popular there too, ranging from funds, asset managers, trading firms, crypto businesses. They offer the highest available API rate limits. There's also a Kraken OTC desk. Kraken offer 5 fiat currencies and also offer margin and futures trading. To learn more and sign up, go to the Kraken link in the show notes. Next, have you looked into Unchained Capital? They're a Bitcoin financial services company offering a really cool 2 of 3 keys multi-signature vault product. You can use Trezor or Ledger wallets, and you still maintain control with your 2 keys and reduce the single point of failure risk. Multi-signature helps protect you against the proverbial $5 wrench attack, as you can distribute your keys. If you create an Unchained vault, you also get 3 free months of access to Safety Moose's Bitcoin Standard Research Bulletin, a fantastic resource. Unchained also offers Bitcoin collateralized loans, allowing you to get USD liquidity without selling your Bitcoins, meaning you don't trigger a capital gains event. This could be tax efficient for a hodler, enabling them to continue hodling rather than selling Bitcoins. While a loan is outstanding, your Bitcoin is stored in a dedicated multi-sig address under collaborative custody, with Unchained holding 1 of 3 keys, you hold a second key, and Unchained's independent third-party key agent holding the third key. To learn more and sign up, go to the Unchained Capital link in the show notes. In this conversation, Connor and I talk about the way that Lightning Channel participants keep each other honest, and then we go into watchtowers with a bit of a deep dive on how they work. I hope you enjoy this conversation. On to the interview. Connor, mate, I am a big fan of what you guys are doing at Lightning Labs, and I've been trying to get you on for a while, and I'm glad that we were finally able to make it happen. So welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thank you, Stefan. Yeah, it's been a while since we first met in Australia. And we've been kind of busy putting stuff together for ODOT 7 recently, but it's great to have that almost complete, and great to be able to share some of the stuff we've been doing recently on watchtowers and such.
Yeah, there's a lot of excitement. I think there's a lot of different feedback coming out of Bitcoin, out of the Bitcoin community, as it were. But yeah, what I was keen to discuss with you today is this whole watchtowers concept, and try and deep dive on that exact idea. But I think before we go into watchtowers, it might be good to just go through just a quick example of like a channel setup and a breach, just in a non-watchtower world. So
yeah, certainly.
Just for example's sake, let's say I'm running LND, you're running LND. I want to set up a channel with you, and I want to put 4 million sats into that channel, or 0.04 BTC. Right. And so, now we've got that channel open, and that's like the initial state. And then if I wanted to make a payment to you, what is going on kind of underneath the surface is my LND saying, yeah, let's change the state of this channel such that, let's say if I pay you 1 million, it's saying, oh, now Connor has 1 million in the balance, and now I have only 3 million sats in my balance. And then I suppose now, let's say, we've been paying attention to Michael Goldstein's "Everyone is a Scammer" article, and I'm actually a scammer, right? And now let's say I try to scam you. Yeah, suppose, I suppose I'm a massive scammer, and this has all been a long con, and I now maliciously try to broadcast the incorrect state to the blockchain. So what's happening there, I guess, just to explain that, is instead of broadcasting a Bitcoin transaction with a balance of 3 million for me and 1 million for you, I might attempt to broadcast a transaction that gives me 4 million sats and 0 for you, right? And so could you just explain for us, like, without watchtowers, how would LND deal with that?
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great explanation. So so that state with 4 million sats on your side was sort of the initial state. And so once you sent that over to me, we enter this sort of agreement where that state's been revoked, and I actually have this key to spend a special path on your commitment transaction for that prior historical state. Now, what's going to happen is LND is always monitoring the chain for spends of the funding output. When your commitment transaction hits, it causes a spend of that output, and that triggers a series of processing in LND that will basically sort of assess the situation and say, was this a breach or not, by looking at is it the latest state or not. And after determining that, it will also understand that it can spend this breach path. So, and there may be several outputs on any given commitment transaction that can be revoked, and it will take all those outputs, sign, produce witnesses and signatures that spend from them, and sweep all those funds immediately back into the wallet. And the reason I'm able to do that is because those outputs have what's called a CSV delay, or relative time lock. That prevents them, that when you broadcast, you are saying, you are basically holding yourself to let's say 144 block window where you can't move the funds, and you give me this opportunity to revoke them. That's sort of what makes the channel secure. So if you try to cheat, I know that I'll have this window to try and rectify the situation. And so if I'm online, I'll spend those coins back to my wallet, and it's really no harm, no foul, because I actually just took more money than I was supposed to have. Right? You would only sent me 1 million sats, and I just took all 4 million minus fees.
You've scammed the scammer.
Yeah.
You've won, Connor.
That's what you get for cheating.
Right. And so what it's getting at there is, at the time, let's say I'm the scammer in this scenario, and I am trying to kind of cheat you and steal the balance. And what it's doing is, at the time that I try to breach you, I actually don't have access to those funds yet.
Correct.
And that's the check sequence verify, which is the relative time lock. That's the CSV code, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, how does LND detect the breach? Is it just sort of monitoring the blockchain for any sort of movement that touches this particular output, or how does it do that?
Yeah, that's correct. So it depends. The way it actually detects this depends on the backend. If you're using an RPC backend like BTCD or Bitcoin D, the RPC interface has a way to notify when a particular outpoint or UTXO gets spent. And so with those RPC interfaces, you sort of subscribe to notifications on those outputs. With Neutrino, it's a little different. Because you're doing because it's a light client, it has to do all the filtering locally, but more or less when a new block comes in, it downloads the filter for it and checks if any of the channels that are mine. I don't really need to monitor all the other ones for breaches. I really care about my own. So I'll look in that filter for my own sort of scripts being spent. And if it matches, we'll fetch the block and double check whether or not it was or actually not spent. And then that produces a notification internally in LND that kind of does the same effect as if you would subscribe via RPC.
Right. So I think that's the example then of, that's like the justice transaction, right? So that's saying, okay, someone's trying to scam you. Let me do the justice transaction,
right.
What's the correct term? I know that's like a colloquial term. What's the actual term?
Breach remedy transaction is, I think, what they call it in the spec or the white paper. But yeah, the breach remedy, justice transaction, those are the same thing. Basically, those are that's the transaction that takes all the revoked funds on a commitment transaction that was revoked, and then sweeps it back to my wallet and basically takes all the funds for myself, because the other person inherently either tried to cheat or accidentally restored an old state from a backup or something.
Excellent. And I suppose we might just quickly point out for the listeners as well that the behavior of that is proposed to change with L2. So if we get L2, the actual punishment will actually change, where instead of in that scenario, your LND node taking the full balance, your LND node would just publish the correct state. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. So you would publish, let's say, it's always a game of I publish the more correct state. So I could publish a newer one. If I happen to also not know the latest one, you could then publish another one later than that. But basically, it ratchets all the way up to whoever knows the latest one. Correct. And then more or less, the resulting balance is then played out on chain. Whatever HTLCs were there at the time will sort of be played out. Whereas right now, it's if you play an old state, even if there are HTLCs on it, you just ignore that and you just sweep it all, because it's cheating.
Yeah, okay. And so I'm also interested to discuss the difference between a collaborative close and an uncooperative close. So can you help articulate what's going on there?
Sure. So a channel is identified by its funding out point, which is a 2 of 2 multi-sig output in the blockchain. So because it's a 2 of 2, anything that basically has a signature from either participant is allowed to move those coins. when you do off-chain transactions, you have these sort of commitment transactions that are both signed by both signatures, or they're signed by both signatures by me and you, and those allow us at any point in time. So I guess one thing to also clarify is that commitment transactions are asymmetric. So I will have a whole chain of commitment transactions for myself, and you'll have sort of their mirror image on your node, and that produces like this full asymmetric history. So and all of those are signed with these two signatures. So any one of them at any point in time can be broadcast, and the blockchain doesn't necessarily know whether it's an old state or a new state, and whether it's like the most recent or who's cheating. But it does see that it has a multi-sig, and it will accept it and let it confirm and spend that. So a unilateral close is when either party just publishes one of those pre-signed states. Now, a cooperative close says, okay, we're just going to sign a new transaction, ignore all the history, and we're just going to spend those into a way that splits out the outputs or splits up the amount however we agree. So if we ended up with 1 million and 3 million Satoshis in the channel, we can just sign a cooperative close, which looks basically like a regular payment in Bitcoin, other than the fact that it's spending this 2 of 2 multisig that splits up the payment, that splits up the amount between you and I. Now, the benefits here are that you're not encumbered by any sort of time locks. It's a lot cheaper because there's a couple transactions that can play out on chain depending on how many HTLCs were there or things like that. But so it's an advantage to always try to cooperative close, but that's not always the case. If one of us were to lose state, then our only option is for one of us to sort of publish this like unilateral transaction, for example, because maybe you lost the signing keys and you can't actually like derive that sort of cooperative close transaction now.
Fascinating. So I guess just to quickly paraphrase that, just for the listeners, make sure everyone can follow along. It's essentially saying in the cooperative close case, there is no time lock placed on the Bitcoins that have been spent out of that, because it's, we agreed that this is the correct state. It's 3 million and 1 million, right? And in the unilateral case, that's the example where, going back to what we were saying about the CSV, the check sequence verify, meaning that there's an additional time until, depending on that window, I think you said 144 blocks, and I presume that can be tuned as well. The length
and
of
LND
that
scales that based on how much is in the channel currently. Yeah. So when more is at stake, it gets longer. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think the other thing with that is also as over time, if we are right, we're both bullish on Bitcoin and we think a lot more people are going to use Bitcoin, then obviously the blockchain will become more and more full. And so then it will become more and more, because part of Lightning's security model is if somebody is trying to cheat you, you need to be able to do your Justice TX back. And I guess tuning that window in terms of how many blocks that CSV is essentially how you can kind of allow people the chance to do a remedy.
Correct. That is correct. Yeah. There's some other interesting dynamics at play there, though, too, because, for example, in the case where you sent me 1 million and you had 3, but now you're trying to steal 4 back, or trying to get back to a state where you had 4, because I'm only promised 1 million at that point in time, I have 3 million sats available to spend on fees. So you publishing a breach trying to earn back 1 million, you may pay more in fees to outbid me to send that transaction than like you may actually gain from doing it. So so there's also those things to be aware of. So it is a little bit, because I think I can basically have a scorched earth policy and say like, I was only promised 1 million, I just want to get 1 million. Like, you have a lot more of like bidding to do basically to get in there. It's definitely possible, but it's like, how much do you really want to scam someone out of their 1 million Bitcoin when you're gonna have to spend more than 3 to get 1 back? If that makes sense.
Ah, fascinating. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's now go into watchtowers. So enter watchtowers. Why might we need a watchtower?
That's a great question. So watchtowers are for well, in the case when like a node is offline, it can't really do this monitoring where it's watching for the funding output to be spent, getting those notifications over RPC or Neutrino. And so the issue becomes, if my node is offline, say I have a mobile phone, or just my node crashed for some reason and I'm out on a hike for the weekend. There could be a period where you say you see me go down because we're not connected, or we haven't talked to each other in a week or something. and you go ahead and try to cheat me because you're saying like, well, this seems like the best time to do it. Like, no better time than now. So you publish this old state trying to take this. And if I don't come back online within a reasonable amount of time before that CSV delay is has expired and allowed you to now move the coins, then I lose those funds that I was initially promised. And so the solution here is to basically outsource the ability to do this monitoring on behalf of nodes that may have intermittent connectivity, like a mobile phone, or just as sort of like a backup measure for like a large institution or company that doesn't want to like have any sort of service outage prevent them from being able to keep their funds safe. So that's really where watchtowers come in. And I think an interesting analogy there is to sort of think of a watchtower as a form of like channel insurance. You basically are having this other person like help you to basically make sure your funds are safe, and they can do that without kind of your assistance. And they'll like they'll go to court for you. They'll attest to the fact that this was actually a breach transaction, and that you're entitled to those funds, and help you get that back.
Fascinating. So then, now that watchtower is not, I guess we can get into a little bit more detail in the future, but how does the watchtower detect a breach?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah. So one of the interesting aspects to a watchtower, well, there's there could be a number of different ways. I think the design space here is really, really, really large. But in the current protocol, what happens is, because I guess to start with, like, one of the basic goals of that is one of the basic goals of the watchtower protocol I've been working on is that we don't want the watchtower to necessarily know which channels it's actually monitoring. So it doesn't have the option to actually just hook up to a Bitcoin DRPC interface and get a notification for UTXOs. That is one way to build a watchtower, but it comes at the expense of all of the users' privacy, because you now know exactly which channels you're watching. And now you can also say like, oh, if that node is public, for example, I can connect to them and test if they're online. Now the watchtower has the ability to see like, are these people online? So we wanted to remove the ability for the watchtower to like actively know which channels it's monitoring. And so that dictates this other approach where we use the transaction identifiers, so the TX IDs of the breached commitment transactions, and we generate what's called a hint. And the hint is generated by sort of hashing the breach transaction using no additional secret data, but more or less the appearance of the breached transaction ID on the blockchain allows the watchtower to decrypt some state and spend the transaction and basically broadcast the justice transaction for the user without them being online. So I guess to clarify, what you would do as a tower is you take a block and you look at all the transactions in it. You'd sort of take their transactions IDs, hash them again, and now you get sort of these hints, and you check your database for any of the hints that match. So you might be looking through your database for like 2,000 different hints for any given block, and if any of them match, you can basically also turn that into a decryption key and create the justice transaction.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a bit complicated, but I think I'm sort of struggling to follow. But yeah, so I guess the other thing then is, how is it that the watchtower can't steal your funds, right? If I'm a newbie and I don't really understand what this is, why is it that the watchtower can't steal my money?
So that's perfect. So basically, what allows the user to spend the breach transaction normally when it's online is that it knows the sort of secret key to all of these like revocation clauses on the transaction. So, like I said, there's a specific clause that has this revocation public key, and I, as the user, am online. I know the secret key, and I just craft a transaction and sign it, and that spends back to my wallet. What prevents the watchtower from doing that is that we never give the watchtower that key. So the watchtower doesn't have unilateral control over where those funds end up. Instead, what we do is when a phone, for example, wants to basically send this data to the tower so that it can do its job, I pre-sign a transaction that spends from it. So more or less what this looks like is every time you pay someone an L&D, you pretend as if the other person already tried to breach you. And you basically sign transactions that basically say like, if this had happened, this is what I would do with it. And then I take that transaction and encrypt pieces of it and send it to the tower. So all the tower's doing is basically decrypting this information, putting it back together, and broadcasting a transaction that I pre-authorized.
Right, and so it's kind of already preset which address it's going to, for example.
Yeah,
Right.
so it would be preset to an address that I control. So all they can do is broadcast, and it'll end up in my wallet.
Okay, got it. Got it. All right. And now I think another thing that's interesting is the funding and operation model of these watchtowers. So is the idea that, I'm going to do this, I'm going to be an entrepreneur and I'm going to run a watchtower service, or is it more like we're relying on people being like an altruistic watchtower guardian?
I think this is very interesting because uh, initially we sort of imagined that that most watchtowers would be operating for a reward. And I think that's still like a very possible likelihood in the future, just because if someone's doing a good job, you want to incentivize them to continue a good job. Also, like, if you want your tower to stay in business and keep watching and for breaches for you, you're going to want to pay them something probably. But it was kind of later on that we also realized there was a niche. There was a niche that could be served by having these sort of altruistic towers. And it's funny that you call it that, because that's actually what we call them, like, in the code base. um, so like yeah, and an altruistic tower basically, like, the only distinction here is that a altruist tower, when it creates a justice transaction, there is one output, and all the funds except for fees go back to you, me as the user. For a reward tower is the other name. There are two outputs. One is a reward paying to the tower, so paying it for doing a good job and like actually responding while I wasn't online, and then the rest of it goes back to myself. So really, the only difference is in how the money gets splits up between the two users. And so I think you'll probably see use cases for either. I think, for example, it doesn't really make sense for a company to run their own watchtower and then give it a reward. It's all their money, right? And that's just more fees and stuff like that. So um, also, if like you have a service or an app and you want to provide a like watchtower for your users, you might not choose to charge them because they have other ways of like monetizing something or monetizing their services and stuff like that. Um, so there are a lot of use cases where I think an altruistic tower is going to be useful. Um, we did build the reward towers are mostly built out in terms of L&D. There are a couple of like things to fine tune there as far as just like testing and stuff like that. But for the most part, that's also completed as well, and that will allow people to also offer services where they get paid to do that. And then it'll be up to users on whether or not they want to have a tower that, or a company that might want to offer an altruistic tower, or if they choose to, they might choose to pay for a reward tower that offers like really good reliable service. Maybe they know it's a like respectable watchtower. Um, so yeah, basically users will have control over that, and it'll be interesting to see which one plays out. But I suspect we'll be seeing both in the wild.
Fascinating stuff. So we're basically just going to see what happens and see what people try and start up and see if they want to run it as a business.
Yeah, pretty much.
And then the question then is, how much would the fees be? And I guess I'm also thinking now, does it work from a UTXO point of view? Like, if the amount of the fee is so small that the UTXO is like a dust, or do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, if I have a 1 cent channel and I'm giving you 0.01%, then
Yeah.
like that doesn't make any sense, right? So things like that are like the client won't even try to back those up. If a tower detects you trying to back up like dumb amounts like that, it'll just like reject you and say go away. Um, and like yeah, because the reward rates are negotiated up front, so I can see like whether I'm getting 1% or 0% or 99%. But it's interesting because you don't know the channels you're watching, so you don't know the actual full balance. um, but at the very least, basically, a reward tower would have the option to filter out like, am I getting like a reasonable amount? The other thing you can do is you can also set there's a proportional and a base reward. So I can at least set that I get like 4x a dust like UTXO plus some proportion of the channel size. So there's ways you can fine tune it. Yeah. But yeah, so those that'll mostly be configurable, and then it'll be interesting to see how the fee market develops. I think ideally the interesting part about watchtowers is that hopefully none of this code ever executes.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
right? Like if everything were perfect, like none of this code would ever run. So it's unclear like how much you'd want to base your business model around people actually getting breached. I think a more likely scenario is that people just pay like a small amount to say, I'll pay the tower like, a couple cents and say like, I'm going to back up 10,000 up like of these states to you. And that'll hold me as a mobile phone for like months
Yeah.
kind of thing. And, basically there you're just charging for like someone to store a bunch of data blobs the size of tweets. So it's really not that bad from a like storage perspective. So I think the cost will kind of remain pretty minimal. And it's also a more stable source of income for like a tower. Whereas a breach might be like, oh, it all. There might be like one day where a bunch of breaches happen this year, and other than that, you have no idea what your future business model looks like. But it's still possible to do that. So
Yeah, who knows? Maybe we see like Lightning service providers and they give you like incoming liquidity and they say, oh, yeah, and we'll give you a watchtower service as well. Or they'll try to bundle it together with other things. I don't know. I'm
yeah,
just kind
yeah.
of spitballing.
And I have some suspicion that like if you want to use a reward tower, you probably have a bigger channel that you want to make sure the watchtower is incentivized to broadcast for you, kind of thing. Um, but yeah, that's kind of my underlying assumption. But we'll see how that works out in practice.
Yeah, right. Also, another one that's interesting to me is with Lightning, we've got, so in that example, remember the 3 million sats, 1 million sats example, that's in the example where you and I are making direct payments to each other. Now, the other component of Lightning is the multi-hop nature of it. So let's say you've got another connection with Laolu, say, right, and he's routing a payment through you to me, and so then what I'm getting at here is, how does Watchtowers protect in that case for the routed amount, as opposed to you and I having the direct 3 million one sat, that amount? Is there a difference there, or?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So from the perspective of the watchtower, no. And from how L&D will protect against that, or really any watchtower application will protect against that, no. There's not really any difference there. Yeah, one interesting thing there is that, like, if I'm on a mobile phone, for example, I'm probably not going to be routing. So that case actually occurs less on a mobile phone. If you are a routing node, you kind of have this assumption that you're online and available all the time. And so, like, your dependence on watchtowers is sort of reduced. But yeah, if you were running a watchtower, it would treat them all identically. And I suspect that people will do that, as sort of like a fail-over mode, and like, safety net.
All right, so let's talk about privacy then. So what are the things that we have to think about from a privacy point of view with watchtowers?
So there are a number of different things I think that come into play. I think we kind of touched on some of them. One is like making sure that the watchtower doesn't know what channels it's watching. That's important for kind of knowing, like, if someone tries to come to the watchtower and say, "Help me collude against this person," it has no idea what it's actually watching, so it's hard for it to actually even try to target users in that sense. There's other notions of just like traffic analysis, for example. Like, if I can watch your packets go by and detect by their size, whether you're doing like a reward tower, an altruistic tower, that would allow some fingerprinting. If you can detect based on, like, just like I said, the size of the messages you're sending, all those things can be sort of like revealing in terms of like what channel it is, or just what user. There's also instances of like timing attacks where if I'm always make payments every day at 2 o'clock, the watchtower can sort of try to like sift through that data and determine that these are like sort of the same user based on like those habits. And there are kind of a number of different aspects that are similar to that, where like you want to mitigate the amount of like de-anonymization that the tower has access to, especially in sort of like this setting of, once it has all the data, it now has a database of like records to search through. Like, how can you minimize the amount of information that the watchtower can learn from that? So I think there's a host, probably 10 or 11 different things that you could probably enumerate in terms of like privacy, and yeah. So I'd say those are probably like some of the most important ones, though.
So of those, what are you thinking in terms of L&D watchtowers out of the privacy considerations that you've named?
Yeah, so I mean, I think obviously for us, I think like these privacy metrics were a pretty big like motivating factor in terms of like the final design that we have in L&D. For example, well, one of the ways you mitigate against people knowing which channel you're watching is this idea of sort of a session. And a session works by kind of touched on this earlier as well, but you might pay for sort of 10,000 like updates up front, or the ability to send it 10,000 updates. And that is agnostic of any channel in particular. You're basically just saying, I want 10,000 slots, take whatever I give you. And then slowly you can fill those up, but they're not tied to any particular channel or user. You can back up. You can also have, like, say you had 5 different towers up at once. I could back some of them up to this one, some states up to another one, and kind of like rotate across them. There's really no need to like have them all watch like all histories of all channels and stuff like that. So that allows the client a lot of freedom in how it picks and uses different heuristics to sort of cover its traffic from the towers themselves. So that, I think that was like one of the big designs that I think had been talked about on the mailing list for a bit, and then we ended up deciding like the privacy benefits there were sort of like worth the extra complexity. Other things like, for example, the traffic analysis. The current protocol has fixed size payloads for like every aspect of the protocol at this point. So you can't tell, even just like during like the handshake when the client communicates with the tower, you can't tell whether it's doing a reward or an altruist like session. And for example, like all the blobs that get sent to the tower, these encrypted blobs with the pieces of the justice transaction, those are all like fixed size as well. So just by looking through the database, there's no we tried to limit the amount of like observable data that would like help pin back to someone. So I think all these things combined, there are a number of things where we've basically from a protocol and data level have tried to remove that sort of ability to fingerprint. I'd say the other things that kind of remain are sort of like timing analysis level things. When I send these to the tower, how do I and who to send those to, all these like ideas of tower rotation, things like that. Those have yet to be implemented, but basically all the building blocks are there and the protocol to allow them to develop. And so as we continue to build on Watchtowers, then we will have more of those features kind of brought into L&D.
Right. And just to clarify, the idea then, if you were to say have 5 different channels, you could use different watchtowers for each one. Is that the idea?
Mm-hmm, correct.
Right.
Yep.
So you're not sort of putting all your trust in one watchtower to look out for you for every single Lightning channel that you have. Got it.
Correct. You can also back them all up to 5 different towers, for example, and then you have redundancy, for example. Yeah, I think my end goal would be to have like, I have 5, but I want to back up to 3, and then it just kind of like auto rotates between them and kind of scrambles the patterns between like which ones it's actually using. I think something like that would end up like being pretty cool. Mm-hmm. So just so that like your entire history of use of that channel is not stored on one tower.
Yeah, and that definitely makes it a little bit harder for somebody to try and attack you from a privacy point of view. And I think it is a good point around this whole altruistic thing as well, because the speculation is, even now, like in terms of Bitcoin transactions and Electrum, the speculation is that some of these chain analysis companies are the ones who run the public Electrum servers, right? Because they, in doing so, can help, from their point of view, they want to try and cluster you and figure out, okay, this guy has X, Y, and Z UTXOs, and we saw him access it from this IP. Well, that's already pretty bad from a privacy point of view. And I suppose
precisely, yeah,
to some extent, what you're talking about here is to try and design the system in such a way that it's kind of harder to that sort of outcome to happen.
Precisely, yeah. I think the way we sort of attacked this was from the perspective of, okay, let's assume that the entire Watchtower infrastructure was concentrated by like a single entity. What is the most privacy that we could get out of like a protocol between all the clients and that entity, and how do we protect users in that case? In the worst case that it devolves to it, So, and maybe not one. You kind of need like maybe a couple to be able to do this, like ideas of like rotation, redundancy, stuff like that. But if there are large entities, we want to protect against the case where people, maybe this service makes it so easy that a lot of people connect to it. We want to make sure that we have the utmost protections in place for those sort of like worst case like setups. And, hopefully in doing so, then actually doing so isn't maybe so bad, or maybe so bad as if like we didn't have all these anonymity protections in place.
Right. And I think another thing that comes to this is around the cost of running a watchtower. Because, again, coming back to that example of who would run an Electrum public server, well, who has an incentive and the resources to do that? Well, chain analysis companies do that. So
Mhm.
in the same way, it's kind of like, it's sort of a similar idea of like trying to keep the cost of running a full node cheap, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
let's talk a little bit about, what does it sort of cost to run a watchtower? And then also, if you could just touch on watchtowers, if there's any impact there from like if you're using neutrino or a pruned node.
Sure, sure. So I think the overall cost of running a tower is minimal in, obviously depending on scale. But I think like on a per user basis, it's really not too bad. Um, Fundamentally, you have, as a watchtower, you do one thing every 10 minutes in terms of like with the chain, right? You fetch one block, you hash like 2,000 transactions, you look up in a database for 2,000 things, and that's all you do from like that end of the perspective. The other side of things is having more or less a server that just accepts clients and writes their updates into this database, and that happens in an ongoing process. So really, like the fundamental like scalability limitations will be like, can you handle a bunch of connections? Is your box capable of handling clients, and how does that look when you scale it out to thousands of users, for example, or millions? And like the actual and yeah, so the actual like performance requirements on like the chain and on that side are like fairly minimal. You have the scale, which only impacts sort of the server side, like accepting of states, and then your only other like real limitation besides that is how much disk space you have. Um, and as I said earlier, like sort of this initial version has these sort of blobs that are about 300 bytes um, per per sort of like update every time like the equipment transactions are updated. So it's like about, like I said earlier, that's you basically storing a tweet every time someone makes a payment, which probably isn't too bad. I suspect that's not too bad from a perspective of like someone with like a reasonable amount of infrastructure. So as far as whether you can do this with like a neutrino or a prune node, yes, you can do it with a prune node. And in fact, it's probably better because it gives you more space for handling all these updates. Um, you can also do neutrino, which again also saves space, but you also then, of course, run the risk of not being, in theory, on the right chain because it's not fully validating. But that can be also protected by just pointing it to a like sort of gateway full node that is validating. And then like all of your watchtower services can be sort of very light and independent of that. So I think that's also a pretty good way of doing it, I think. So
Excellent. And so the other thing then is the hard drive capacity requirements. Is it one of those things that if you are running Watchtower and you've got a lot of users who want to say, hey Connor, I want to give you my 5 channels to watch for me, and then there's a lot of payments passing through those channels, does that start to become more troublesome from a computational hard drive cost or seek times?
so it depends on your setup and it depends on your implementation. There are basically this problem of like taking like the transactions in a block and finding which like hints and encrypted justice transactions match that is like perfectly parallelizable. So in theory, you can shard this out over multiple machines if you need to, and you could even store the database like that. So there's also ways of like seeking in theory. Like if you had like a spinning disk, it might be a fair amount of effort to actually do that. But there are other ways of sort of storing data on disk that would be more performant. If you had the proper indexes in place. So I mean, I think it could be if like you don't have the proper optimizations in place. But once you have those optimizations, and you should be like well on your way to like in my opinion, I don't think I foresee an issue in terms of like actually uh, ramping that up into like across multiple machines if you need to.
All right. What about limitations of watchtowers? Now, just thinking out loud, I suppose the main risk really is just that if I were to have only one watchtower and I'm trusting that watchtower and then the watchtower fails me, it doesn't broadcast the justice transaction for me. I guess that's one of the main
Hmm.
risks.
Hmm.
Are there any kind of risks or limitations that you see there?
Yeah, no, so that's a good one, and I mean, and for example, at the moment, like in L&D, this initial rollout will allow you to configure a single watchtower. But we have some PRs down the road that are still in progress that would allow you to do multiple. And obviously, like there's still a risk that all n of your towers go down.
Yeah.
And that is obviously a risk, but hopefully the redundancy allows you to mitigate those, and by picking maybe mutually disinterested parties or something like that. I think another real fundamental limitation of watchtowers is that because the watchtower doesn't have access to your keys, you have to sign these transactions with sort of like a predetermined fee rate. And so, like, depending on the fee market at any given time, your transaction like may or may not like have the sort of like weight to get into a block, and that can be mitigated in a couple of ways. You can more or less sign transactions at different fee rates and send those to different towers. So maybe the different towers are now have different like fee rate transactions, um, and other things like that. But still, at the end of the day, if I sign a transaction for 200 satoshis a byte and the fee market is at 250, I mean, there isn't like a whole lot you can do without being online. I think that's probably the more fundamental limitation, and something that, like, without giving up your keys, it's kind of hard to like um, extend the protocol to be able to do that without that sort of extra authorization. This could be a that being said, there are ways to sort of like get around this with, like, if you also include a reward for the tower, um, or the tower is also trying to make sure that it does its job, it can also attach fees itself to those transactions and bring them down on your behalf. It's not quite the same, and, like, I think it'd be interesting to work out more of the dynamics of the incentives on that edge case. But it is also possible for the watchtower to bump fees for you, and whether or not that's agreed via some, like, you know service agreement or whatever is like not, or is undefined at this point. But I think that's a current limitation of sort of like how watchtowers work at the moment, and hopefully, like, we will have some more mitigations against that down the road.
Yeah, fascinating. So I guess just to paraphrase again for the listeners, what you're saying there is, and this is part of this is owing to the difficulty right now, just in general, of fee estimation. And so currently, the way Lightning Network works is that when you open that channel with somebody, you're already I think there's a fee reserve that's being allotted, and and part of the problem is, or theoretically the problem is, if the fee market moves dramatically in that time, then when you want to do the close or the justice transaction, then it might be not adequate
Sure.
in terms of the amount left over for a fee. And then, so I guess when you're bringing in the watchtower aspect of it, that's kind of another level of complexity that you're bringing, because it means now the watchtower might not have enough fee
Mm-hmm.
to get the transaction inside that CSV 144 blocks, or in that example 144 blocks. But again, as you mentioned, I think that is something that could get tuned over time, right? So imagine, 5 or 10 years down the line, we start to have more full blocks. Would L&D developers at that point decide, okay, well, maybe we need to expand the CSV window to give more time?
Yeah, that's definitely possible. And like right now, L&D will scale that CSV based on like the amount in the channel. Because right now, I think the max channel size is somewhere around like $1,500 or so. And if you don't want to have your $1,500 on the line for one day, maybe you want 2 weeks. L&D sort of scales it out already in some sort of like linear fashion. Um, Down the road, yeah, we can adjust those. Another interesting thing is, like, if, say, you back up some channel states today and you back them up with 50 sats a byte, but then a year down the road you see that, okay, maybe the fee market is permanent, and it's stuck at around like 100 satoshis a byte. You can go back and back up all of your states again with like 100 satoshis a byte. So you can like retroactively upload these states as well, and you can bump fee rates in that sort of sense. The case you brought up with the commitment transactions sort of having this set fee rate, and that may not be enough in the future. There is some ongoing work in the Bolt 1.1 spec, that will allow you to basically have a minimal fee on the commitment transaction, and then you will attach fees later at the time you want to actually broadcast. And which is sort of similar to that idea with the watchtowers, where like it has some pre-committed fee, but then the watchtower can also attach as many fees as necessary on your behalf if it also doesn't happen to be enough. So those ideas are sort of related, and I think this is something we're coming to grips with off-chain protocols. But yeah, there's some interesting directions there.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Okay, so look, let's talk a little bit about how watchtowers might evolve in the future. So obviously there are many different Lightning teams. There's you guys, there's Lightning Labs, there's Blockstream's team, and then there's also Async, and then there's some other teams as well who are working on Lightning. Is is there a plan to try and have watchtowers become part of the actual spec, or would it be like everyone sort of does their own thing?
I think ideally they would be incorporated into the spec. But given the design space at this point, I think it's a little premature to have people commit to something before we've like given it a sufficient amount of testing. At least that's been like our opinion. So, in the process, we've been doing some tests, seeing what works. I think we'd like to like run this for a bit in the wild and really get get an idea for, are there any pain points that we'd like to address before moving forward with a final spec version that then people have to commit to. The unfortunate thing about like a lot of these things is that if I think if we were to rush into it and sort of like encourage the wider community to commit to like this protocol that may have these sort of defects, is that the defaults end up being very sticky, and that is typically like pretty bad from a privacy perspective. Um, you know, if if once people go and implement like Watchtower V1, there's not very much incentive to implement Watchtower V2 kind of thing. So I think ideally what we're hoping for is to learn from this experience and then also take any new info we get from this sort of release and package that all up into like a more cohesive like spec proposal. And then hopefully like those get out of the box, the spec version V1 would be like a more complete and maybe like have all those kinks worked out, and then we can move from there. So I think that's sort of the initial like idea for how we get to spec land.
How does LND watchtowers compare with? I know there is a BLW Bitcoin Lightning
Mm-hmm.
Wallet by I can't. I'm not sure if I pronounced the guy's name correctly. I think it's Anton Kumagorodsky, and he I think he has some kind of watchtower baked into that
Mm-hmm.
wallet product. So how does LND compare with that?
That's a good question. From my understanding, um, I think I think the towers in LND I think are designed from the ground up to be a little more privacy preserving. I think that's probably one big distinction. I think also he uses this cool thing for like blinded tokens where you pay and then you basically redeem those tokens later to be able to update states or stuff like that. Um, and I'm not totally sure, but I don't know if the protocol is accessible outside of the app. It might be, but I'm not totally familiar with the specifics. Um, and then maybe like one other difference would be sort of whether or not it actually does like a reward or is purely altruistic. Um, but yeah, so there are a couple distinctions there. But I think the biggest one is probably that I think in that case the tower sort of knows which channels it's watching, whereas with LND you would basically like delineate that.
Yeah, another one actually I was meaning to ask as well is interoperability. So presumably, if you are an LND user, or no, maybe the other, it might be better to go the other way around. If you're a C Lightning user, you can't use an LND watchtower, or like, is there would they have to kind of use their own?
No, there'd be no fundamental restriction for using the tower or not. It's a matter of implementing the client side protocol. Um, so like, or the server side. But if there were already LND watchtowers running, then to integrate that into another implementation is a matter of making a client that does all the steps that the LND ones do. And that becomes easier to do once there's like a formal spec, apart from just like reading other people's code. Um, but no, that's definitely possible, and yeah, so you can definitely take advantage and like do cross pollination in that sense.
Right. Okay, and we touched on this one earlier around L2 and how that is a new proposed model, and hopefully once we get Schnorr and so on, we would move to L2. But L2 has a different punishment model, which we were touching on earlier. Can you explain if there's any impacts there from a watchtower point of view?
Yeah, I think there are some new use cases, or there are some new ways that you can kind of formulate a watchtower with L2. Um, Mainly because with this idea of you only need the latest state. In theory, right now with sort of this with the watchtower design for sort of revocation based channels, the watchtower ends up keeping every state because it needs to be able to revoke directly off of uh, any of these possible states that the counterparty can produce and like broadcast on chain. With L2, you can kind of like keep the last one, and that automatically skips all the way to the end. And that's, that works as a sort of justice transaction for all the prior states. So there is the ability to sort of implement this constant space watchtower with L2. You can also sort of do an L2 tower in the same sort of style as the one that exists today. Basically, you would back up and keep every state. The advantage of that over a constant space sort of design would be the level of privacy that it offers, because when I'm sort of updating the last state and telling the tower like, hey, here's the new latest state, you have to tell it the previous one which it needs to delete, and so that inherently like gives you this chain of actions that link all these sort of updates to each other. Whereas the one where you sort of keep everything, you don't necessarily know what's being replaced, what's being updated. So there is a trade-off in terms of like privacy and the amount of storage for the tower. Personally, I think if with an L2 tower, if it's like my own personal like private company, for example, and I want to back up my nodes, I think this is undoubtedly like a good way to do it, because you basically keep like a constant amount of space for all your channels, and you don't care about privacy, right? I am the person. I already know everything about my company. I think there definitely becomes a realistic trade-off when you are interfacing with maybe a service that is running this. How much do you trust that service to protect your privacy or give it away? How much do you care as a user? Maybe the L2 constant space one actually costs more, but also then you have this privacy trade-off. So I think it's a little unclear like how you'd modify it, but the current protocol can be used in a way that is compatible with L2 with sort of the same sort of privacy model. But with L2, you also get these extra possibilities in terms of how you construct a watchtower as well. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Now, I know you guys are working very hard on LND 0.7, so can you just tell us a little bit about what's coming with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff. This has been, so I think we did our last release around 3 months ago, and so this will be kind of a more targeted release with like a handful of features that I think are really cool. One of them being this sort of like initial release of altruistic towers. Um, another another cool feature is that we now do routing. We now introduce this like probability based sort of scoring system into the routing heuristics. So we now will consider like what is the likelihood that this node will actually fail when we actually pathfind. And as we sort of like attempt payments and learn like, oh, this route succeeded or this hop failed, we'll feed that back into our sort of our mental model of how the network is looking, behaving at any given time, and then that will inform sort of like this like it'll inform sort of like which path to find next based off of like sort of the historical patterns of like the network that we've observed. So I think it's a really powerful primitive, because as the model continues to improve and we continue to improve the like data fed into it, then you really can start to like learn the network in a way that like for each user is independent, right? Because they're all in different positions within the network. So the model should be able to learn like in my position within the network, these are like the best routes to take, and they always are able to handle my payments, and these always fail, and distinguish those two cases. So this is sort of the beginnings of like a more sentient like routing capability within the network.
It's coming alive.
It is.
And with that, then, is it encourage? And that, I guess, that's helping encourage uptime, and maybe it's encouraging nodes to keep the channels well balanced and not lopsided.
That's
as
correct.
an example.
That's correct. Yeah. So it'll start to pick out though, like it'll start to pick out those nodes that are like maybe indirectly doing this, and sort of like favor those when in the routing preferences. So I think that's really cool, and I think that will become like a major factor when right now we're like discarding a lot of really valuable data about like, I've attempted this payment, this hop fails every time, why do I keep trying this? And this will feed all that back into making that whole system more reliable. And let's see some other cool features. So one of my features I'm really excited about is we've improved the initial sync times for basically all backends by using a feature that we built into the sort of seed format, I guess now almost a year and a half ago. So for those of you who aren't familiar, LND uses a specific seed format that we call AEZ, which is kind of like a class of cipher seeds where your actual like seed data is encrypted. And inside that, like the seed has a birthday that we measure in terms of days since Bitcoin Genesis, which is like some random thing we made up. But basically, there's a birthday in there that measures like roughly how far from the Genesis block the seed is created. And what that allows you to do is when you create a new wallet, it basically the wallet has a birthday now. And instead of rescanning the entire chain for your funds, it knows that no funds can be created before the wallet's birthday, before the seed was created. So what we do now is when you come up and you have like a fully synced chain, we now just binary search for your birthday and then start from there. So that has like really good effects. I mean, if you're doing a rescan on 500,000 blocks, but you just created the wallet, you now just get to skip straight to the tip, kind of thing. And also, when you're doing a recovery, this will also work because it'll see that like, oh, it's only a third of the way back, not all the way back to Genesis. So it should have a pretty good performance improvement for all backends. I think Bitcoin desync is down from like 50x or something like that. So it's pretty massive improvement. So I think excited people to give that a try.
I find the birthday thing hilarious, man. I don't know. To me, it's just like, how old is your LND node? How many birthdays has it had, Connor?
It's going on. It's probably going on like 450, something like that. 450 Bitcoin days since Bitcoin. Oh no, days since Bitcoin Genesis. Yeah. Well, it's about
right.
450
But you're talking
days
450
old.
days back from now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose just for the listeners, I guess it helps search, right? Like when your software is trying to figure out, okay, what's my balance? It's kind of helping you kind of search more quickly and not waste kind of computational power trying to search really far back in the chain when the birthday is telling you, no, actually, I only started this wallet 30 days ago, so don't search back like 2 years on the blockchain, right?
Correct. And the reason for any of those who are also wondering why we pick days since Bitcoin Genesis as the metric, like I think this is kind of interesting too. That I don't think it's really been explained anywhere, but you could just put like a timestamp in there, but that's more like 8 bytes, and we were like short on space in the seed format. We wanted to have as much space available for other things, so we wanted to squeeze it down into a like 2 bytes, and so we needed something with like more coarser granularity. So we ended up realizing that days is like a pretty sufficient granularity when talk in terms of wallet, right? Bitcoin's been around for 10 years. It's like 3,000 days. Like you should be able to like get a pretty good estimate for the birthday with that. There's also the case of like you can set your birthday before without even syncing the chain, right? If you need to know like a particular block hash or height that the chain is at, you can't make the seed until you sync the chain. So this allows you to create the seed without any data but like the current time. And the other reason that it's from Bitcoin is because we know there's no funds on testnets or anything before the Bitcoin Genesis block. So then that's kind of the metric. And then that will basically allow us to like express birthdays through, I think, 2189 or something. So we should be good.
Well, we'll be long dead before people in the year 2189 have to deal with it.
I'll let someone else figure that out.
Okay. Anything else you wanted to touch on with LND 0.7?
I guess not too much. I think that covers sort of like the majority of the changes there. Oh, there is one more, and that is we sort of refactored a lot of the internal like router state for the payments and being able to like reliably display them over the RPC. So you can now like make a payment, kill LND, come back, and like all that information is like properly displayed over the RPC and accounted for. Before, like you didn't lose any money, but the RPC data like may not have been like all in the correct places. So there's been some pretty like big refactorings there to make all that possible. That's one of like major other things that are in LND now. So that's been a lot of work by Johan, who sort of spearheaded that. And so that'll enable, I think, a lot more like services to really like rely on LND as like a pure data metric, without having to jump through hoops to like do the accounting. So I think that'll be another big feature that people are looking for, and that we've had a lot of requests for too.
Excellent. Well, look, I think that's just about all we've got time for. So, Connor, make sure before we let you go, tell everyone where they can find you and where they can keep up with what you guys are doing at Lightning Labs.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephan. Yeah, I'm on Twitter at BitConnor, Connor with an E. So you can find me there. I'm also on the LND Slack, LND developer community quite frequently. And yeah, hit me up there. And thank you so much, Stephan. I appreciate it.
I really enjoyed that chat with Connor. Make sure you follow him on Twitter. Also, share this episode with your friends who want to learn more about how Lightning Network keeps channel partners honest, and Watchtowers, obviously. You can see the show notes on my website, stephanlivera.com. You can also subscribe there. Don't forget to rate and review the podcast. That helps new people find me. If you've got any feedback or you want to inquire about advertising, you can DM me on Twitter at Stephan Livera or email me, stephanlivera@pm.me. That's it from me, guys. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.